Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in Salesforce Epics Hour. And today we have a great star, Andrew Fawcett, with us. So let me hand over him for his introduction and the presentation. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone at Apex Hours. It's Andy Fawcett here. I thought I'd introduce myself a little bit briefly before we got into the meat of this session, talking about the latest edition of the book. Life before Salesforce for me was really around on-premise applications, building enterprise apps in .NET. And yes, COBOL was where I really began my career, but worked in C++ and Java and other languages. And pretty much as the cloud started to take off, Financial Force was given birth to build the first financials accounting application in the cloud on Salesforce. So this is really where Salesforce got under my skin and started to really create great exposure for myself, because I'm pretty much an introvert by heart, but something happened around Dreamforce 2013, 2014, where I met this amazing community and started blogging, and really a book followed after that. And really honored to be part of that. Was somewhere on that tiny picture is me in the MVP community, so joined that community back in 2013. Life personally took me to the US, where I am right now, in 2017, and great pleasure to join Salesforce in 2018 as a product manager, where I currently am right now. And I am a massive Lego fan, so it was really even more of a pleasure to see the building that I work in created in Lego with the Lego architecture set. And below there you see my wife Sarah and our little French bulldog Lilo. So that's a little bit about me. What's really began that journey was cats. Cats in fridges. A lot of people giggled when I first brought this slide up, and it was really the beginning of talking about essentially the separation of concerns. And hopefully some of you watching this are familiar with this slide and are giggling along as well, seeing it again. And after that, things like Apex Patterns became Apex Enterprise Patterns open source, as they moved from the curation and ownership of Financial Force into the community. So thanks to John and Daniels and all of the folks that are managing that open source repository right now as we speak. And I even have a t-shirt on, or a hoodie on, that talks about declarative lookup rollup summary tools that are now under the management of the Salesforce.org Commons program. And we have an amazing group of people that are now driving that capability forward. Still an open source product, of course. Brick in the Cloud was a real foray for me to bring Lego and Salesforce together. So some of you might have remembered Lego robots trundling around Dreamforce a few years ago. And that was an interesting endeavor to bring together robots and Salesforce together in a timely manner, I can say. And of course, we're here to talk about the book, and it was back nearly 10 years ago that the book started in 2014. And this is the first edition that you're looking at. And we're going to be talking about the fourth, and along with my blog. So if you're interested in some of the other things that are not Salesforce related or into my professional career, I am actually starting to dabble in retro computing and hardware. So you'll find me over in various retro computing channels, working on building PCBs and electronics that let older computers do modern things, shall we say, or even older computers do older things in a better way. So it's a little bit of the background, but let's talk about the books. A great honor to have been provided the opportunities to create these books and share them with the community. And many people, which we'll call out towards the end of the presentation, have been involved, least of which Pact, the publisher, in the creation and review and contribution content forwards for these books. And right here in the bottom right-hand corner, it is our latest fourth edition. So who is it for? Well, it's aimed at Salesforce developers, of course. So this is about interpreting enterprise patterns and enterprise mindset and thinking on the Salesforce platform. So enterprise means thinking about scale, how you structure your code, how you can make your code more easy to consume by new people, by new developers, existing developers, you think about performance, response times, how you develop your user experiences, the full gamut of how you build an app and actually distribute it. But again, all focused on the Salesforce platform. So it is for developers that have been developing somewhat a number of years on the platform and have some general understanding of it. And it's also for developers that are new to the platform, but have got a lot of experience building and some of these principles on other platforms. So as I mentioned, it is the 4th edition. It's 681 pages, which is nearly double the size of the original 1st edition. So much so that the publisher came up with a great idea to actually break the book. It is one book, of course, but as you open it, it's into 4 distinct chapters, which cover the 4 parts rather, which cover the 16 chapters. So there's around 42 pages per chapter. So it's a great way actually to break into parts and obviously chapters to make it a bit more consumable. And a great part of the effort in building this book is the sample application, modernizing that each iteration, making sure it's using the latest technologies and tools, and building out the use case, which is a Formula One motor racing use case that I chose to continue with in this edition of the book as well. So it's a little bit about what the book's about. What we're going to do now is kind of go into what to expect. And what I wanted to try and cover here is, if you're new to the book, what you kind of might find in each of the parts. Within each chapters, of course, there are parts, but also what are some of the changes that have been made in respect to this edition, and some of the highlights there, because there are a few significant changes. There's also some brand new content as well. So we're talking about packaging apps either for your own business internally and how you distribute your applications within your organization, or if you're an ISV or maybe both, and you want to distribute your applications even further, then App Exchange is a mechanism for doing that. So the book really, previous editions of the book tended to kind of lean into the more App Exchange thing. A lot of people found the book still useful in general for all of the other content, which of course applies regardless of how you're packaging. But this edition really calls out, oh, this is applicable if you're an ISV, or if you're not an ISV, this bit's applicable or not. So it helps kind of guide you a little bit more in terms of your persona as a developer, regardless of whether you're an ISV or not. And of course, the enterprise separation concerns, hopefully most people are familiar with, but this is a way of distributing your code and the logic within it. So it's very clear what part of the code does what. It makes it easier to maintain and expand. And the book covers a lot about building UIs, whether it's mobile UIs or web UIs, and doing that declaratively as well as programmatically, and the pros and cons for that. And a big part of the book goes into the back end. We don't just talk about the front end and the Apex code, we talk about how you store data. And we're talking about how you access that data and what are the different access patterns you can use at scale, and what are the trade-offs for those. A brand new chapter of the book talks about using other languages in addition to Apex to leverage your skills that you might have in Java or Node, and using Heroku or functions to do that. And we go into testing. One of the areas that I've personally grown a lot in my career, and thankful to a number of folks called out in the book, is really understanding the concepts of different levels of testing: unit testing, system testing, regression testing, performance testing, and really trying to fit the different approaches into those categories for Salesforce developers, particularly going into unit testing in great detail. Lastly, it goes into, we build these applications not just to be used in an island, but inevitably there's integration requirements, whether you're distributing an App Exchange or using your application internally. So we talk a little bit about how you might meet those demands for your customers or your organization that wants to integrate with your application to make it ever more useful and valuable to them. Everything comes with tips and tricks and calls out. So it seems from the reviews of the book, a lot of people really find those useful. Every now and again, there'll be a tip box or an info box, which just takes a sideline, talks about something relevant, but kind of off the beaten path a little bit. You can read those or not, it's up to you, but a lot of people do seem to find those very useful. So yeah, that is a little bit of overview. What we're going to do next is dive into the parts. So there's 4 of these, and the way that we structured this is part 1 is about the key concepts for application development. And it kicks things off straight away with building and publishing your application. And I wanted to get that out of the way straight away, just to see the full cycle before the app got too complicated, so that you really got an end-to-end experience of building an app, again, whether you're distributing it internally or whether you're distributing it externally, and get that sense of how that feels and what's involved in it. And the reason why historically I've always felt that way is because there's a lot of underpinnings in how you proceed forward, particularly as an ISV, on decisions you make early on and when you're architecting and designing your application that impacts how your customers consume your application. So concepts, that is a key concept, distribution. Another key concept is the platform is not just hosting code, it's hosting all sorts of wonderful tools that improve your productivity as a developer, but also those that can customize your application later. And if you don't really think about those and you just build everything with code, then A, you're not really being as efficient as a Salesforce developer, and B, you're not really helping those customize your application later when they need to, by not thinking about how Flow might integrate with your application, the impact of Apex triggers on those that use your application, and extensibility points and APIs that exist for the platform. So this chapter really kind of gets into the detail of that. Storage is another really key part of what's involved in architecting an application and thinking about really your use cases and how they affect the volume of the data that is in your objects. That is a really key consideration, and it's important to know where you're going to get growth in your objects and where it's not going to grow so much, particularly when you start building code against those objects. So this chapter really covers all the options and considerations for designing your storage, and of course covers different storage mechanisms, relational, non-relational, big objects and other things like that. And finally, another key concept really on any platform, not just Salesforce, is kind of what's the request context when you send something to the back end. What is it really doing? Is it opening a transaction? Are you opening a transaction? Where are the logs going? All of the logic that your customers apply and declarative logic you apply, where does that logic run and where does your logic run? So the chapter 4 is a really important grounding chapter that talks about the principle of a request and how Salesforce handles that. And again, you're better off for it because you know a little bit about what might influence your application further down the road. So let's dig into part 1, a little bit of a highlight. These are just excerpts from the book. A key thing that makes this book, for me at least, easy to kind of relate to and hopefully relate to the audience to relate to, the reader to relate to, is make it grounded on something we all somewhat understand. And whether you understand Formula One motor racing or not, most people understand the concept of a race. In a race, there are cars. In this case, there are drivers, there are contestants for each race, and there's a season. Typically each year there are several races, and at the end an overall winner. So the book starts to begin to model the object model and of course code and experiences upon the Formula One motor racing. You don't need to be an expert in Formula One motor racing. Forgive me, you'll see some of my biases on my favorite drivers coming out as you read through the book. So no excuses there. But this is really where we start in part 1, talking about storage. And of course, how you package your application and whether it's an ISV or internal, how it gets installed and some of the implications of that installation. So ultimately, it's about automating the creation, upgrading, and installation. We are using second generation packages in the book. Earlier versions of the book did talk about some of the pros and cons of first and second generation, but this is really leaning into the second generation packaging technique because it supports that kind of opportunity to think about it as an internal distribution or an external distribution. And that's one of the key values of 2GP. One of the other aspects covered in part 1 of the book is around understanding the different types of objects. Object is a very overloaded word in Salesforce, and really understanding what is a custom setting object, what is a custom metadata type object, what is a custom object or a standard object, and so on and so forth. So there's a big table in there. And obviously a lot of discussion around what are your use cases. And in this case, configuration is one of the topics it drills into. So a lot of pros and cons, largely, spoiler alert, custom metadata types are largely the yes column. but still there are some considerations if there's a kind of a gray area between custom object, a custom configuration and effectively product data that you might want to consider here. So it gives you a bit of a tour of all of the object types, not just for configuration, but for storage as well. And one of the kind of most infamous slides here is really the beginnings of the patterns that the book spends 3 chapters on. And that's really aggregating the fact that there are many, many opportunities for Apex code to be inserted into the platform, for it to be invoked, whether you're handling REST APIs or UI controllers or batch Apex or inbound email handlers, the queuable async. There's all so many. In fact, I think the book makes the disclosure at this point that this diagram is really just representative rather than an exclusive list of everything. But the point being made here is that it's best to really think about a single point where all that code, all those entry points converge, because otherwise you find your code become very fragmented as you start to figure out where you've attached all of this code. So it really starts to ground on the fact that despite all of the extensibility places in the platform to put Apex code, think about a singular place where they can all route through. So this slide really just ends a little bit of the discussion on part 1, which is about kind of some of the changes. So chapter 1 did, as I mentioned earlier, start to, in 4th edition of the book, lean into the difference between if you're installing for the purposes or building a package or app for the purposes of internal distribution versus external distribution. And there's also some SF CLI updates in there as well. In the 2nd chapter, user mode came into its first reference in the book, but this is by no means not the last. We did talk about user mode quite a lot, and we talk about the value of Salesforce APIs and some of the new APIs as we start to understand how we might leverage platform features. Chapter 3 covers updates around custom metadata and options for replicating data, and there's more kind of discussion around external data sources here that go into some of the latest latest features since the last edition around external data. And finally, chapter 4 of this part really starts to open up what Apex user mode means, the new ubiquity and transaction ID contexts, I'm supposed to say contexts, and more on platform cache. I was delighted to find that since the last edition of the book, the platform cache usability has really taken a little step up in terms of seeing what's in the caches and managing kind of and monitoring what's going on in the caches as your app executes. So definitely kind of beefed that up a little bit more. So it's great to see some more investment in around platform cache. So that's kind of the overview of part 1. Let's move into part 2, where we really lean into the Apex enterprise patterns, or FFlib, if you like. But really, before we get into those, each of these chapters introduces the patterns, which really originate from Martin Fowler, very distinguished industry expert on multiple platforms. And that's what's so great about these patterns, is that they've been applied from different, from a point of view of whatever platform you might ever build them on. Now they're tuned to Salesforce, but Martin Fowler really began the concept of many of the patterns that you see here, and each of the chapters walks through the equivalent patterns that he has described. And in first chapter, we talk about the service layer, which we've already discussed, in terms of that layer that helps bring all of your code together, no matter where it's being invoked from. And it's typically processes that involve multiple objects. Your domain layer is all about linking logic that gets typically invoked from your triggers, but we'll talk a little bit more about some exceptions to that later. And your selector layer really is about taking all of your SOCL logic, all your data access logic, and putting that in its own layer as well. So that gives you a lot of agility to shift even how you might implement your data model. If it's all in one place, the access layer is all in one place, or shift some of how your services are used in the future, maybe expose some of those services as APIs. So part 2 is all about that. And then finally, part 2 ends with that new chapter that talks about how to take your skills, if you desire to create them or have them, that are in Java and Node, and use them at the back end, and how you might do that with Heroku L functions. And again, we use an example application based on Formula One to illustrate how you might do that with those technologies. So a big part of the patterns is this diagram, which really visually splits apart the 4 principles of the service layer logic, your domain logic, rather the 3 principles, sorry, and selector logic, and then illustrates how you might consume some of that logic, either as a controller or a batch class. Obviously, it's not exhaustive here, but there is a concept of the service boundary. And another big part of the book is really thinking about how you use DML, and a big principle everybody should learn from the very beginning, and in fact would apply to any platform, is about being really conscious of how much I/O you're doing. And it's not really that visible on Salesforce I/O, like you don't really open an I/O library and go directly to the database, but you are doing reads and writes and updates. And Salesforce does a lot of magic for us, but it doesn't really understand what you're trying to achieve as well as you do. And what this means is, if you do a lot of DML separately or independently in loops, it can be less efficient than aggregating all of that together. So typically we do that with maps and lists and things like that, but the unit of work pattern from Martin Fowler has been created here in Apex, allows us to aggregate all of that together with some simple method calls. And then when we're done computing all of our updates to the database, then we can call commit, and it will put it all together in a more efficient bundle to update the database. So unit of work is a pattern that's not new to the book at all. It's been here from the very beginning. But for those of you wondering about some of the key patterns, then this is another one that's really important, and that's used typically by the service layer. So I wanted to get into one of the changes in this chapter that's come about through the community feedback, and I had a great pleasure working with a number of the reviewers on the book, and we'll give them a big shout out at the end of it. But one of them was really keen to point out that there is an emergent trend to think about splitting logic that you put in your domain layer from that logic that's invoked by the trigger context versus logic that's just belongs to the objects in all other contexts. So whether you're calling logic that's business logic from your service layer versus kind of validation logic that's coming from your trigger layer. So this is kind of what everybody would hopefully be familiar with today, and we've called it the combined domain class logic pattern, CDCLC. Those of you that know that I invented DLRS will know that I'm not particularly good at acronyms, but here it is. It's CDCL, and it's combined domain class logic. It's the one that we're most familiar with right now, and it's the one that's been in the book and continues to be in the book just for simplicity right now. But the latest one really defines the split domain class logic model. It's not all that different. If I toggle between them, you really see that what's happening is we're splitting out the contestants class, the domain class, and the driver domain class into handlers. And the handlers are really just there for the Apex trigger logic, and they probably would delegate to other classes. But the difference is that there's a separate class for just the trigger logic, and everything else relating to the object's behavior, its kind of features such as awarding championship points or doing other tasks, are put into the separate domain class. So this is talked about in more detail than I've got available right now in the book, but it is an opportunity, and clearly you can move from this to this if you so desire, and even vice versa. So it's not a kind of choice you absolutely have to make straight away. You could see how things evolve, and the libraries and things still work either way with both of these models. So delighted to include that piece of experience from the community in the book as well. So I promised we'd get back to user mode, and we have. And one of the principles that shifted in the book is that in the past, it wasn't really possible to have user mode the default for everything that you do in your application. You had to think about it by adding sharing, or in latter cases start to add some of these keywords to enforce user mode, or you had to do the good old describe checks and check whether the field had access and so on. There wasn't really any clean way of just saying, you know what, it's good practice to run in user mode, but every now and again I want to elevate to system mode. Well, what's been possible now with the advancements with Apex and user mode is the library that the book uses, the fflib library, can now be taught about user mode. So in this case, the unit of work pattern is customized. It's not like this when you get it from the repo, but in the book, it customizes it in a way that's configuration based rather, and it switches on user mode for unit of work. So you can be guaranteed that if you're using a unit of work and you've just instantiated it here, and there's ways you can do this if you're not using this particular approach with the application class, you can be assured that it knows about user mode and it will enforce it. So if you're very heavily into unit of work for the reasons I mentioned earlier, then it's great to be able to switch this on in unit of work. And the other thing that the book talks about is how important it is if you're running in a world where user mode is on everywhere, there is a danger, a very real danger, that you kind of over provision access. What I mean by that is if it's checking for access for every single thing that the app's doing, that means you have to grant that access to the users. Now, in some cases, your app might do things on behalf of the user that you really don't want the user to be able to have access to. And that's where system mode comes in. And the unit of work can be instantiated in those use cases in a system mode context. And the book goes into the pros and cons that I've just kind of hinted at a little bit there about why you would run in system mode versus user mode a little bit more. But it's a super important thing to keep in mind, because if you don't and you kind of overuse user mode, you end up actually widening the permissions that have to be granted by your admins or by your app to objects that might not necessarily be needed to be seen by the user or manipulated by the user. So be very careful. It's a great pattern and definitely aligns with industry best practices of secure by default, which is the pattern which is really aligning with. But you do need to be cognizant of when to use system mode, which is kind of weird because we're coming out of a world where everything was system mode and we had to kind of think about when to use user mode. Now we're kind of flipping it around. User mode is the default as configured here in the book sample application, and then system mode is the thing you have to think about. So kind of weird. Yeah, this also talks about the same thing for the selector as well. So whether you're now reading data, all of what I've just said applies, whether you're reading data or updating data, of course. So know when to run your queries in system mode, know when to switch on user mode, and so on and so forth. And there's a little bit of an example there of running in system mode. That particular query, above average lap times. The users of your application probably don't need to see all of the race data, all the detailed data. Maybe you don't want them to, but they do want to see like average information. So this is an example where you run that query in system mode and avoid having to grant access to that object. Moving into backend patterns written in other languages, the book includes a web application and an API compatible with open API standards now. And this is I've got to say, a fair chunk of work, more than I ever expected for this chapter. It's brand new. Most of the chapters take a good chunk of time to update and refine and check all the things to be updated. But this one was kind of labor of love, really. We've got a Heroku app. It's actually running Node.js, and it's using Lightning Web Components, actually. And you can, of course, use other web libraries are out there. But for this audience and the book's readers, I chose to illustrate how you can run more or less your same Lightning components, or at least the skills that you use to build Lightning components in the context of a more elastically scalable web experience. And the same with an API. You can use Apex to build APIs, but if you actually have desire to create more scalable APIs or APIs in other languages, or you just need more flexibility than Apex REST affords, then this chapter goes into a lot of detail about open API standards, and it actually gets revisited later in the book when we talk about external services and integration, because this is also a great pattern for building APIs, period, and integrating them into Salesforce if you're using the open API standard. So do check out that if you're interested in using other skills, elastically scaling, more using kind of complementary data stores for your applications, then these technologies are a good one to consider. So got an architecture diagram that features throughout the chapter, and the numbers really represent kind of each of the areas where it drills into them. So it takes a step-by-step approach through the website architecture, which is on the left here, which is the Formula Force public website and API, how that's built with Heroku, and also some of the ways in which the data in your Lightning application gets pulled into that web experience. So a lot of use cases around Heroku tend to result in folks building web experiences, but they still need the data for those experiences that resides in Salesforce. So this talks about Heroku Connect and other aspects. Functions is covered here also in terms of how you might customize more of that automation within your Formula Force application using Java, actually. And yeah, so do check it out. That is a great new chapter. Hopefully those that are interested in other languages or bringing libraries in that have been in your organizations and you don't necessarily want to port them to Apex, it's another good way of just bringing backend logic into your application that's written in other languages as well. So some of the new things in chapter 2 and part 2, the section on service layer are basically an overhaul in terms of how it thinks about security. It flipped into that user mode thinking and system mode by exception. The domain layer started to cover that CDCL and SDCL pattern of splitting or not splitting your domain class. Talks about the new user mode features. We've also improved some things around Apex interface discovery that have latterly been added to the language, as well as improving S-object error testing. So a very tiny feature. It was released a number of releases ago now, but it's ever so important when you're doing testing to have more granular access to S-objects. So I kind of really like that feature, actually. And then in chapter 7, we added some things on user mode again. So those are changes and when to use system mode. And then chapter 8 is that brand new chapter that we just talked about, pros and cons of languages other than Apex, extending web and APIs written in Node, and how to kind of integrate some of that logic into your Salesforce automations, like Flow is covered. So keeping moving along quickly, we've got part 3, penultimate part, which really covers user interfaces. Firstly, a grounding on LWC. It itself has a pretty good separation of concerns. Those of you that are built with it know that it really helps you separate out the UI and the UI logic from that, and in eventing as well separated out. So it talks a little bit about that. And then chapter 10 really gets into one of my favorite aspects of developing on the Salesforce platform, is just the UI framework of being able to use the record pages, expand the record pages, add UI to Flow, add UI to the mobile devices. It takes so much emphasis off us building UIs from scratch. Of course, we have the facility to do that, but if you really don't need to do that, then there's so much extensibility that's available. So the race management app is the application that gets created here, and we have various objects and tabs surfacing, and there's a walkthrough of the different ways in which you can communicate with the backend logic. There's quite a few pros and cons around that, whether you use Visualforce, Lightning components, websites, mobile devices. So, and also how API limits are enforced or not varies depending on how you do your client server communications. So the book really covers kind of pros and cons for that. If you're just largely doing Lightning development, it's probably not all that interesting, but if you're actually building clients elsewhere as well, then I think you'll find that useful. And it talks about also how to add action buttons, including like downloading content as well. That sample has been updated to use Lightning web components. So we used to have to only rely on Aura for that. So a great deal of the Aura stuff has gone now, as Salesforce enhanced all of these previous Aura-only areas to become available in Lightning. So yeah, as I said earlier, it goes through the kind of topology of a Lightning web component, the CSS, the HTML, the JS, and the metadata that belongs to it. And yeah, again, my favorite part of developing in Lightning Experience is all of the extensibility. You know, we can create a page, we can create a record and extend that. We can add actions to existing records, influence flow, utility bar, not shown on the screen, is one of my favorite things, is to just have that little pop up at the bottom of the screen and insert some logic no matter where the user is in the system is amazing. I really like that feature. So this really guides you through all of the different ways in which you can embed your application, should I say, in the Lightning experience. So the changes for these chapters, there's quite a lot in LWC in terms of new facilities for integrating where you need not use Aura anymore. There's new prompting alerts, and LWC modal interfaces are really good. And new ways to monitor for limits as well. So really kind of dialed up some of those aspects in chapter 9 for the 4th edition. And then chapter 10, yeah, as mentioned, most of the remaining Aura components, it's great. I think that most developers all appreciate the ability to delete code. And it was great to delete some of those Aura components from the 3rd edition of the book and port those to LWC. And the messaging service gets a shout out with a good walkthrough and an example there. We talk about web security updates and LWC and flow updates as well in this chapter. So quite a few changes in those chapters as well. And then the final part of the book is arguably looks like quite one of the biggest, but it's really rounding out. You've developed your app, you've got how to distribute it, but how do you think about how does it scale? How does it integrate with other things? How do people extend it? Because it can't do everything for everyone. And it's very hard sometimes to resist making your app do everything for everyone. So think about extensibility will keep your app kind of contained in terms of what it does and doesn't do. And the way to mitigate people saying, I want it to do this, I want it to do that, is to think about extensibility. So there's a big focus on that. The persona known as Developer X is introduced in chapter 11. And asynchronous processing and big data volumes is covered extensively in chapter 12. Unit testing, as I mentioned earlier, gets a real deep dive. It talks about other testing principles at kind of summary level around regression testing. And in fact, system tests are kind of what we might already be writing right now in Apex, but this kind of introduces the concept of doing unit tests which don't need to access the database during your test. Which is very powerful and not only for coverage of your code, but speed of your tests as well. So it introduces Apex mocks, which is now one of many actual libraries that use the Apex stub API to build a mocking framework for Salesforce. I'm delighted to have called out some of those other frameworks in that chapter as well. We talk about source control and continuous integration, and then how to build external services into your application or use external services that are not running on Salesforce, but bring them in as if they were part of Salesforce through the amazing external services feature, which now generates code for those services as well, which is pretty cool. And lastly, a lot has happened in the world of AI since I started authoring this book. So forgive me if you don't see references to all the latest and greatest stuff here, but a lot of what is applicable in chapter 16 continues to be applicable as it is today and be built upon going forward. So we round things out with a discussion on kind of reporting and analytics and AI capabilities. And again, there's a worked example of using Salesforce Analytics in that chapter. So I really just wanted to round things out with a little overview of what those chapters cover. And the first part of the final part of chapter part 4 rather covers application APIs. So what's it like to build an API? And your services are your APIs to some degree. So think about the unison of your application, the platform APIs, and how folks can integrate with your application. If all these cogs are working, then you've kind of mastered the integration requirements. If you've just got everything in the red cog and nothing, you're not thinking about anything in the green or the purple, then you're not going to get this kind of smooth integration opportunities for your customers or your partners. So think about all of these cogs when you're thinking about integration. And the book talks about building APIs in Apex. It talks about using eventing as an API. A lot of us think about just building APIs as code, but actually creating an event and publishing that event as part of your application is an API, and somebody can post an event, and that helps you asynchronously scale. Another way of doing extensibility is to use Flow. So it talks about good old Apex actions and Apex interfaces here. So how you can actually integrate Flow as part of your extensibility. So in the past, you might have had an interface that somebody has to implement in code. But with Flow, you can now call Flow from Apex, and you can name the flow in configuration as part of your application installation, which flow the customer's written or the user's written. And it gives a great way of extending the logic of your application by those that can't code. Obviously, great power, great responsibility here, but it's a really exciting opportunity to be able to say, look, if you want to extend the logic here, I'm going to give you a Flow call out, or I'm going to give you an Apex call out, and have either of those options available. So that's really what is being highlighted here, is the ability to have those two extensibility points. This example talks about how we're using data weave. And data weave really, there's a lot more to be said about data weave. I think at this time of writing, or it was in beta, but it really is a powerful way of doing lots of transformations. And the typical use case, but by no means the limiting one, is CSV generation. So I actually had a chunk of code in the previous edition of the book that just used usual CSV generation, and it had bugs in it. It was a really sample code. But now I know that I'm using an industry tried and tested transformation engine, data weave, and it's available for free inside Apex. You don't need to be a MuleSoft customer. And I can just say, right, I'll have it do the transformation for me. I just give it the records and it gives me the result. So it's a great technology. I think I would totally expect the community to be doing a lot more with what can be done here. Like crack open the data weave manual, have a look at all the transformations it can do, have a look at your Apex code and think, could this be transforming my code more efficiently with less code? So it's kind of another language to think about, a language within Apex. And that's it, actually. That is the data weave code for doing a CSV transformation. It's literally that simple. There's obviously a lot of assumptions the code's making here, but if that's all you need, then it's literally those 5 lines of code for doing CSV generation. So some coverage of data weave there. Really important aspect of your data model, and it's covered right at the beginning of the book, is getting your data model understanding and where all the large data volumes are going to exist and what indexes you might need to have and fields that are indexable. There's no escaping the laws of physics when it comes to databases, even those that have been abstracted so much from us that we don't see them. You still need to think about query access patterns. And trust me, if you don't think about them ahead of time, it's very painful to work with customers afterwards when you need to kind of scramble to deal with their volumes and the business implications of that. So it's a very hard area. I'm glad that the book actually originally was a forcing factor for me to understand it as I went through building this content. And I think hopefully the way that it's described in this chapter is really understandable for folks. And if you've ever been scared of what is a selective query, how do I create an index? Hopefully this chapter will demystify that a bit for you. And talks about big objects and asynchronous processing as well. So of course we've got queuables, batch Apex platform events and functions these days. So there's aspects in the book that walk through the pros and cons of each, and really some of the preferences from my perspective of what we should be using for asynchronous processing, and some, of course, worked examples. Platform events is covered as well, and there's a nice diagram here that talks about using platform events. Remember I said just a moment ago that a platform event can be an API, and in this case, an event comes from the car. Maybe the driver has pressed the brake too hard, and that event comes in and it's ingested into the telemetry. And you can use events to flow that in rather than making that a synchronous call. So there's a worked example of how you can use events to help flow some of those asynchronous things into your application. The testing aspect of this part goes into integration, testing for UI, as well as Apex, and then unit testing for Apex. Largely it is about testing code. It does talk about some of the UI aspects, testing of UI in the chapter as well. And it talks about what is a unit test. In some respects, you can test your controller, your service layer, and your domain layer in one test if you wanted to. But there are some pros and cons with doing that. So this talks about the value of breaking down, testing just the code specifically in the controller in absence of anything else, and likewise the service and the domain. So some definite pros and cons in terms of how much kind of flexibility you can get and more use cases you can test in your logic, which makes your code more robust at the time, but also makes your code more robust in the future as well. So you get to try different things that may or may not be so obvious when you're using this technique to test code. So it actually uses, breaks away from a little bit from the standard sample to use like a very, very simple object model here, a car, a dashboard, an engine, and a display, and talks about how you can unit test each of these individually. So I chose that because the code base had got fairly complicated at this point in the book. So I kind of pulled it back out and said, if you just have this simple Apex classes, 4 Apex classes, how do you do unit testing? So it's really good if you want to just dip into that bit of the chapter, because you don't actually need so much prior knowledge of the app beforehand. And yeah, we talk about the stub frameworks and other frameworks, Apex Mockery, Universal Mock, all sorts of mock related libraries and frameworks are being appeared. I don't go into detail on these, but I do call them out. I think I want to really highlight where I can, appropriate to some of the innovation that's going on around the open source community in Salesforce. So yeah, that's what some of the code looks like in terms of how you do mocking. It's really not enough time left in this session. Hopefully you're still along for the ride, but definitely you can check out my blog, and also there's a lot of stuff on Apex mocks in the internet written by many other people as well. But this one walks through it with a kind of more detailed solution scenario in place in my book. And talks about testing web components, really important. Those are code, those are complex. We should test those as well. And there's some great industry integration here. This is not a Salesforce library. This is a industry library that's being used. So you will gain skills that you can use or may already have in adopting this library outside of Salesforce. And that's some of the code that's used, very similar to the technique we use in Apex, right? To separate out the different fragments of test code. We also go into integration finally around how you might add flow into the user interface logic. So there's an example of bringing some updates to the leaderboard once a trigger is triggered, and how flow can be used. So at this stage, we're really talking about what consumers of your app can do versus what you might want to package. And outbound calls are also been improved recently in the 4th edition, and of course in the platform. And you can now use code generation. In fact, you can see there the generated code is used from external services to make sure that you've got really easy to use endpoints that you input into Salesforce. The code gets generated for you basically, which is pretty cool. So there's a worked example of a service running on Heroku, Java service. It can run it on any platform, but as long as it exposes an open API, then this technique works perfectly. So if you've not heard of Open API, definitely go and check that out. Salesforce itself in its APIs is starting to support it. If you're interested in creating APIs, you definitely need to understand that technology, because it makes it so your API is so much more discoverable, and in this case, usable by others. There's that generated code that it creates, the The generated code maybe isn't the prettiest, to be honest, but it is generated, and that is very much appreciated. So this is the QR code service being called, and then you get a resulting QR code in the flow component. Some of the aspects of extending the platform comes into analytics. So there's a worked example of how to use Analytics Studio to do like machine generated analysis on who's the best driver, given the data historically, why were they good, what track were they good. So it's a fairly dense section, but it's good if you really want to go beyond Salesforce reporting and Salesforce analytics, and you want to go into Analytics Studio and see like the next level of reporting and details and how your app can benefit from that. So quickly through the updates that we created, chapter 11 got more extensibility patterns added to it for Flow. Open API and Data Weave was added to chapter 11 rather. Chapter 12 got some updates to big objects, not particularly in a good way. Some of the changes in the capabilities that are being retired are reflected in the chapter here, just for note for readers. So the async processing is removed, but this does call out other async models that have been created as well. Chapter 13 adds testing of functions as well as more on LWC and Flow. In chapter 14, we have alternative approaches to CI/CD, notably, I should move my window out here, different servers that can be used. It does make a call out to DevOps, the amazing DevOps Center. I didn't really have the time to go deep into that, but it does make a call out to the amazing DevOps Center for those of you that want to go and use that product capability. And lots of updates in chapter 15 around external services, which I just covered in detail around using Open API to bring in APIs into your Apex and Salesforce environment. And then finally, the updates around Analytics Studio. That product has changed a lot visually and also kind of flow-wise. So there was quite a few changes needed to chapter 16 to keep up with the changes for Analytics Studio. So I think I'm not sure how long that was. I mean, I have a feeling I maybe took way longer than we probably both anticipated. But I will finish it up with a massive thank you to John M. Daniel, Sebastian Costanzo, Arvind, and forward by Daniel J. Peter. Thank you so much, all of those that helped, and PAC-T for the 4th edition. And also, I just want to call out, and I'll not name everybody here, all the past reviewers. This is now the collaboration of many people, including myself and the publisher, over 4 editions. So it is quite a growth, as we covered earlier, and just want to reach back to all of those people that have helped in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd editions and say a massive thank you. But above all, thank you so much to the Salesforce community. I really wouldn't have the drive and passion I have to create this book and stand here and hopefully give you however many minutes of content we've created here if I wasn't really driven by the amazing ecosystem and the Salesforce community. So thank you so much.